Ever wondered how something like corn, a staple crop, made its way across ancient landscapes? And what secrets that journey holds about people moving around? Well, today, we're taking a deep dive into exactly that.
Mhm.
We're unpacking a really fascinating new study. It's from Dr. James Watson and his colleagues, published in American Antiquity, and it looks at maize and migration shaping the Sonoran Desert.
A great piece of research.
Yeah, and our mission today really is to explore how these subtle archaeological clues, things like ancient tools, the way people were buried, even human remains themselves, how they reveal these intricate, small-scale migration patterns. These patterns shaped early farming communities in what's now the southwest U.S. and northwest Mexico. So yeah, get ready to connect some surprising dots. Now, for a long time, there have been basically two main ideas floating around about how maize and, other key crops like beans and squash first showed up in the Sonoran Desert. This was during what archaeologists call the Early Agricultural Period, or EAP. That's roughly 2100 BC to AD 50.
Right, and the core debate here is really whether maize arrived with people migrating or if the idea of maize farming spread without large groups moving. So one hypothesis, a long-standing one, suggests it was introduced maybe around 4,500 years ago, right there in the Tucson Basin. And the idea is it came via small-scale migrations of farming groups moving up directly from Mesoamerica.
Okay, so people literally carrying the seeds, the know-how, everything with them, a direct transfer. But what's the alternative view? What else have researchers considered?
Well, the second hypothesis argues more for diffusion, that maize and these other crops sort of spread into the area along existing trade networks, maybe through cultural contact, and then local hunter-gatherers would have gradually adopted these crops and started farming themselves.
So the crops moved, but not necessarily large groups of the original farmers.
Exactly. And archaeological data has actually been used to support both ideas, which makes it, pretty tricky puzzle.
Okay.
But Dr. Watson's study is interesting because it uses three distinct types of archaeological data to try and tease out these more subtle differences in, like, population makeup that might be linked to maize spreading. Oh, and it's probably worth mentioning, too, maize seems to have entered the Sonoran Desert when water was apparently more plentiful. That likely helped it spread and people's willingness to really invest in farming it.
That sets the stage perfectly. Okay, so how did Watson and his team try to shed new light on this? They looked at three key kinds of evidence, almost like, detective work. Let's start with the first clue, the tools, specifically projectile points, stone points.
Yeah, and you might wonder, how can a tiny stone point tell us about people moving around? Well, during this EAP period, archaeologists have identified four different types, but two are really key for this discussion: the Empire points and the San Pedro points. So the San Pedro points, they're generally seen as local, kind of native to the Tucson Basin area. Empire points, though, they're considered non-local, more characteristic of northern Sonora down south. What matters isn't just the exact shape, but sort of what their presence or absence tells us about who was living where.
Right, and this is where it gets really insightful, I think. There's this archaeological site, Las Capas. It dates to the early part of this period, the San Pedro phase. And initially, it was just dominated by those non-local empire points. But get this, other sites nearby, from the same time, only had the local San Pedro points. That's a stark contrast.
So what happened at Las Capas?
Well, apparently there was a major flood event, and people left Las Capas for a while, an occupational hiatus around 1000 BC. And after that, when people came back or new people settled, something really shifted. The site's inhabitants started making mostly the local San Pedro points.
Yeah. So this suggests that maybe those empire points were used by the first wave of migrants. And then over time, either their descendants adopted the local style, or perhaps, those initial groups were replaced or absorbed by local populations.
Okay, so the takeaway here. Researchers often associate projectile points in this region with men, with hunting, and maybe warfare.
That's the traditional association, yes.
So this shift in point types might suggest male-focused migration, maybe tied to what anthropologists call exogamous marriage patterns, like men moving to find partners outside their home group and then eventually integrating into that local culture's way of making tools.
That's certainly one strong interpretation the evidence points towards, yes. Male-focused movement influencing the material culture.
Okay, so tools are one piece. But the study also looked at how people treated their dead. What did the burial practices, the mortuary features, reveal?
Right, and putting this in context, how people bury their dead, the rituals, the grave goods. It often reflects shared group identity, their cultural norms.
Mm.
So when the researchers compared burials linked to the local Tucson Basin tradition with burials linked to that non-local La Playa site,
Mm.
remember, La Playa also had a lot of those empire points.
Ah, yes, the other non-local site.
Exactly. Clear differences popped out. The local burials tended to be more consistent. Bodies usually placed in a flexed, sort of curled position, typically very little or no pigment, like red ochre,
Mm-hmm.
and few grave goods, maybe some shell jewelry or food grinding tools. The non-local burials, though, showed much more variety, different body positions, sometimes extended, sometimes even face down, prone, and they typically use more pigment.
So really distinct cultural signatures in how they handled deaths.
Definitely.
And what's fascinating is that, just like with the projectile points, these differences in burials seem to lessen over time. They homogenized.
That's what the evidence suggests, yes.
Yep.
It points to this dynamic process of interaction, maybe assimilation, maybe population replacement or mixing happening over generations.
Yeah.
These tangible differences between groups seem to fade.
Okay. Tools, burials. And then the third line of evidence, perhaps the most direct, bioarchaeology, studying the human remains themselves. What did the bones tell Dr. Watson's team?
Yeah, this brings us right to the people themselves. What can their physical remains tell us about where they or their ancestors came from? Well, various bioarchaeological studies looking at things like genetics and physical traits indicated that males in this period seem to have higher genetic diversity and variation.
Interesting.
Which again is pretty consistent with that idea of male exogamous marriage men moving around more, bringing different genetic backgrounds with them.
Fits the pattern.
It does. And additionally, other studies looked at facial measurements, tooth dimensions, things like that. They found close biological connections between sites like La Playa and Las Capas. And crucially, they saw greater than expected variation in these physical traits, the phenotype, early on in this EAP sequence. It suggests an early sort of pulse of gene flow.
Like an initial mixing.
Exactly. An initial mixing event that then smoothed out, homogenized over time. So this really supports the idea that more mobile males were likely driving these persistent small-scale migrations within the Sonoran Desert.
Okay, let's try and pull this all together then. You've got these three different angles.
Yeah.
The projectile points changing, the burial practices merging, and the bioarchaeology showing male mobility and early gene flow. What's the clear picture that emerges about those early migrations in the Sonoran Desert?
What really stands out, I think, is how consistently all three lines of evidence point towards small-scale, probably male-dominated, migrations moving northward during this early agricultural period. These weren't necessarily huge waves of people, but smaller groups or individuals moving, bringing with them not just the knowledge of how to grow maize, but also their distinct tools, like the empire points, and their unique ways of burying their dead. Dr. Watson even notes in the paper, he says he's not familiar enough with other areas to identify if similar migrations occurred, but generally it doesn't look like there was a similar movement of people tied specifically to maize elsewhere in North America right at this time.
So the Sonoran Desert situation might be somewhat unique for this period.
It seems like it could be, yeah. A really specific case study in how agriculture and migration intertwined early on.
Okay, so this story of these early farmers in the Sonoran Desert, it then leads us to a fascinating next chapter, doesn't it? The study also explores how these San Pedro phase farmers, the ones who eventually adopted the local points and practices, might have influenced what came later up on the Colorado Plateau. Specifically, the Western Basket Maker II culture, or BM2. That's, 500 BC to 8400?
That's right.
So how did these subtle desert migrations connect to the basket makers way up north?
Well, this is a really critical question. Could these seemingly small-scale movements in the Sonoran Desert have actually laid the groundwork for much broader cultural shifts further north? Archaeologists often consider the Basket Maker II period as the sort of upland correlate to the early agricultural period down south. And for a long time, researchers have kind of hypothesized that there might have been a direct migration of these San Pedro phase farmers from the Sonoran Desert to the Colorado Plateau.
Okay, so let's apply the same lens. What about the projectile points? Did they just carry those San Pedro points north with them? Does that show a direct link?
You'd think that might be the smoking gun, right? But it's actually a bit more complicated. While there are some general similarities, they're both generally wide-bladed dart points with notches. The idea that San Pedro points and Basket Maker points are basically identical isn't really supported when you look closely.
Oh, how are they different?
Basket Maker points tend to be consistently smaller. They often have distinct features, too, like narrower necks where the point attaches to the shaft, and more parallel-sided stems. So the fact that we don't find large numbers of clearly identifiable San Pedro points in dated Western Basket Maker 2 sites up on the plateau makes it hard to argue for a direct, large-scale migration just based on the points alone.
Right, not a simple A to B transfer of the exact same toolkit.
Not exactly. However, remember the association of points with men. That pattern seems to hold in the basket maker context too. So even if the point style changed or adapted, the evidence could still point towards male-centered migration being involved in these northern movements as well.
Okay, so the points are suggestive but not conclusive on their own. What about burial practices? Do we see echoes of those Sonoran distinctions up on the Colorado Plateau among the Western basket makers?
Superficially, yeah, there are some things that make you go, hmm. For instance, Western Basket Maker 2 groups often used multi-individual burials burying several people together.
Okay.
And they also seem to have more varied body orientations compared to the Eastern Basket Maker groups. This variability kind of resonates with those diverse EAP burials we talked about down south, the ones that didn't have a strict directional rule.
Interesting parallel.
It is, but, and there's a big but, preservation is very different between the desert and the plateau, especially for things like textiles, baskets, other perishable items that might have been included in burials. So making really detailed, direct comparisons between EAP and BM2 burial practices is actually pretty challenging. The evidence is intriguing, but maybe less conclusive on its own than we'd like.
Right. The preservation bias makes it tough. So if the tools aren't a perfect match and the burial comparisons are tricky, where does the strongest evidence for this Sonoran Desert to Colorado Plateau connection come from?
Well, this is where the bioarchaeology really shines again. For the Western Basket Maker 2, the evidence from skeletal and genetic studies is much more robust in supporting a migration link back to the Sonoran Desert.
Okay, tell us more.
So, for example, studies looking at dental morphology. The shapes and features of teeth show that Western Basket Maker 2 teeth are actually distinct from their Eastern Basket Maker neighbors. And importantly, they're more closely related to populations from further south, towards Mesoamerica, like the EAP groups.
Wow, okay. Teeth don't lie, as they say.
Yeah, something like that. And then there's the ancient DNA evidence. Analyses of mitochondrial DNA, remember, that's passed down the maternal line?
Right, tracks female ancestry.
Exactly. They found a significant frequency of a specific genetic signature, a haplogroup called haplogroup A, in Western BM2 individuals. This pattern is really consistent with a migration origin model from the south. And interestingly, while the Sonoran evidence seemed to lean towards male-only or male-dominated movement, the mtDNA evidence here might suggest that migration onto the plateau involved family groups, since it's tracking the female line.
Huh. So maybe a slightly different dynamic in this later northern movement, families moving together?
Possibly, or at least women were definitely part of the migration. And then finally, craniometrics measuring skulls. Comparisons showed a really close physical resemblance, a strong phenotypic affinity between Western Basket Maker 2 groups and those earlier EAP groups from the Sonoran Desert. Researchers interpret this as suggesting a direct immigration and colonization by EAP people, establishing a foundational lineage up on the plateau. So when you combine all these bioarchaeological findings, the teeth, the mtDNA, the skull shapes, the picture becomes much, much clearer. It strongly suggests that groups related to those San Pedro phase farmers did migrate north from the Sonoran Desert. They settled in the Western Four Corners area, and they contributed significantly to both the biology and the culture of what we call the Western Basket Maker 2 complex.
Wow. So this deep dive really underscores how crucial even these, relatively small-scale population movements were. They were shaping entire cultures biologically and culturally thousands of years ago.
Absolutely. And putting it into that broader context, migration, even these subtle sort of interregional shifts within the Southwest, clearly played a huge role in shaping the makeup of native populations over millennia. Dr. Watson uses this great phrase, he calls it a palimpsest of cultural and biological community composition, like layers being written over layers through time.
A palimpsest, I like that.
Yeah. And this research also offers a really interesting perspective on what some anthropologists call the migrant paradox, that kind of multi-generational process of how new groups integrate, how cultures blend or change when people move into new communities. We see that playing out archaeologically here.
It's so clear how much these movements mattered. But I imagine figuring all this out from evidence that's thousands of years old must have its challenges, right?
Oh, absolutely. Huge challenges. The study itself acknowledges the limitations. I mean, there are gaps in the archaeological record, both in time and space, particularly in those areas between the Sonoran Desert and the Colorado Plateau,
Yeah.
the potential migration
Back
corridor.
to connecting routes.
Exactly. We need more data from those areas.
Yeah.
And it also highlights the need to keep looking at other types of material culture, too. Things like textiles, if they survive, ground stone tools for processing food, even animal bone tools. They could all add more pieces to this incredibly complex puzzle.
Makes sense. More data points needed.
Always. But, regardless of those gaps, the idea that these deep historical ties might have existed, maybe even preserved through oral histories passed down generations, connections between these distinct desert and plateau peoples, it's really thought-provoking. It could have even led to later migrations back and forth. It's just a testament, really, to the resilience and adaptability of these ancient farmers, navigating environmental changes and social dynamics through movement and interaction over centuries.
It really is. So we've taken quite a journey today, a real deep dive into how these subtle clues from stone points to burial styles to ancient DNA paint this vivid picture. A picture of small-scale, often male-led migrations of early farmers moving north through the Sonoran Desert. And then how those movements likely played a key role in the rise of the Western basket maker culture up on the Colorado Plateau. It leaves you wondering, doesn't it? What more can these advanced methods, like deeper ancient DNA analysis, combined with good old-fashioned archaeology, reveal about this complex web of human connections? About how pivotal technologies like agriculture spread across these vast landscapes? And maybe even how understanding these deep historical movements, these ancient migrant paradoxes, might shed some light on our own modern world, where migration and cultural interaction continue to shape societies every day.
Definitely food for thought.
Absolutely. Keep learning, keep exploring, and keep asking those big questions.